Welcome back to Revenge Jess. In the archive, we don't look at professional betrayals as matters of personality. We look at them as a series of spreadsheets, misallocated assets, and bad accounting. When the subject of this case file thought he could drain the partnership's resources, he assumed the discrepancy wouldn't be noticed. He was wrong. Here's the cold-hearted case. Before I tell you what my managers did to me, I need to tell you what they were responsible for. Because the personal part of this story, the harassment, the professional undermining, the petty campaign that followed my resignation, is only the surface layer. Underneath it is something with a much wider blast radius. The organization I worked for was responsible for producing national statistics, not internal metrics, not departmental performance figures, data that was submitted annually to a government department and then published as part of the national statistical record. The kind of figures that inform policy, shape legislation, and determine where public resource allocation moves in response to documented fluctuations. Data with downstream consequences for people who have never heard of this organization and never will. That data was my responsibility in practice. Not in title. In title, it belonged to management. But management, as I will detail, had made a considered and sustained decision to treat their own role as optional. Rosters, event organization, data correlation, functions explicitly designated as managerial, were quietly redistributed to the team beneath them. Manager A, whom I will call by that designation throughout, reduced her working hours and amended her schedule without disclosing either change to her own superiors, while continuing to draw her full salary. Manager B, approaching retirement and operating accordingly, had effectively vacated his professional obligations months before he vacated his desk. Into that vacuum I worked. For over a year I produced, maintained, and verified the statistical data that carried this organization's name into the national record. I knew those numbers. I knew what they should look like, how they moved year over year, and what the documented variables were that explained legitimate fluctuation. Which is precisely why, when I looked at the 2024 and 2025 figures that management had submitted, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The numbers had been inflated, both the statistical figures and the associated financial data. Not by accident, not by rounding error, by a margin that was inconsistent with every underlying variable I had spent a year tracking. That is the breach, not what was done to me, what was done to the public record, and by extension, to everyone whose policy environment those numbers were designed to accurately reflect. I want to be clear about the personal context because it is relevant to understanding the sequence of events, not as a justification, but as the accurate record of what preceded the professional concern. Several months into my tenure, Manager A began targeting me specifically. The harassment was oriented around my sexual orientation. I followed the prescribed internal process and reported it formally. I will not say it resolved satisfactorily, because it did not. What it did was create a paper trail, a documented record, in the organization's own system, of a management figure whose conduct toward a reporting employee had already required official intervention. That file would matter later. In December, I submitted my resignation and transferred to a different section within the same organization. I took with me the data sheets, roster templates, and operational files I had built over the course of my employment. This requires brief explanation. These were files I had created to fill a management vacuum. They were, by any accurate accounting, the product of work that should have been management's responsibility. The fact that they existed in my file structure was a direct consequence of management's abdication of the roles they were being paid to perform. I was also aware of GDPR obligations that required deletion. I was always going to have to handle these files on departure. The question was only what I would do before I deleted them. Managers A and B, unhappy with my departure and apparently unconcerned about the professional exposure that unhappiness might create, began circulating characterizations of me to my new supervisor. My new supervisor, to their credit, had read my resignation letter and the associated documentation before taking those characterizations at face value. That intervention closed one avenue. But I was not focused on the rumors by that point. I was focused on what I had found in the data. The paper trail I had accumulated over 14 months was not assembled in anticipation of this moment. It was assembled because that is how I work. Emails in which I had provided management with the accurate statistics and correct financial figures when they requested them. Time-stamped, threaded, preserved. Emails in which management had explicitly confirmed, in their own words, that the statistical data was their managerial responsibility to oversee and submit. A specific email instructing me to manage the data on their behalf. And the final data sheets, showing the figures they had actually submitted, alongside the source records that demonstrated what those figures should have been. Every element of the case file had been generated by the ordinary documentation of a job performed carefully over an extended period. I had not manufactured evidence. I had simply retained it. Before I deleted the data sheets, as GDPR required me to, I submitted the case file to HR. That is the action. Everything else is what the documentation produced when it reached the people whose institutional responsibility it was to evaluate it. The submission was organized into 3 components. First, the email chains demonstrating that I had provided management with accurate figures each year they were requested, establishing both the correct baseline and the documented chain of custody for the data. Second, the emails in which management had explicitly confirmed their own accountability for the statistical outputs, their words, their email addresses, their timestamps. Third, the discrepancy between the figures I had provided and the figures that had been submitted to the Government Department for national publication. There is a specific evidentiary weight that attaches to a case where the subject has documented their own culpability in the course of ordinary correspondence. Manager A had not been careful because she had not anticipated that anyone would look. The emails confirming her responsibility for the statistics were not written for an audience. They were written because she needed something done and needed to direct someone to do it. In doing so, she created a time-stamped record of accountability that no subsequent account of events could plausibly supersede. That is what a paper trail actually is. Not a collection of damaging materials assembled in anticipation of a dispute. The accumulated documentation of ordinary professional conduct, which, when the conduct is dishonest, becomes its own indictment. An official audit was opened. The scope of that audit encompasses the falsified statistics, the financial inflation, the management conduct that produced them, and the institutional failures that allowed the discrepancy to reach national publication unchecked. Manager B departed the organization abruptly, ahead of the audit's conclusion. Manager A remains. The audit is active. When it concludes, and the mathematical gap between submitted figures and source records is not a matter of interpretation, the documented liability will attach to the person whose emails confirm she owned the process. I did not engineer that outcome. I submitted organized documentation to the correct institutional channel and allowed the audit process to function as designed. The outcome is the system correcting for falsified inputs. My role was simply to ensure the correction had the materials it needed to proceed. The question the original account asks, "Am I the asshole?" is worth addressing directly because I think it reflects something genuine about how it feels to submit a report that you know will have serious consequences for specific people. The honest answer is that the question misframes the situation. The relevant question is not whether the reporting was proportionate to the personal grievance. It is whether the falsified statistics were a matter of public concern that warranted disclosure to the institution responsible for maintaining the integrity of the national record. And the answer to that question is unambiguous. National statistics that influence legislation are not an internal organizational matter. They are a public accountability instrument. When the figures entering that instrument are inflated, when the data that shapes how legislators understand and respond to real-world conditions is inaccurate, the harm extends well beyond the organization that produced the error. It extends to every downstream decision made in reliance on numbers that did not reflect reality. That harm does not require intent to be real. But in this case, the email trail establishes that the people responsible for the figures were aware of the accurate data and submitted different figures regardless. The personal history, The harassment, the professional abdication, the rumor campaign is context. It explains why I was positioned to identify the discrepancy and why I had accumulated the documentation to substantiate it. But it is not the reason the audit exists. The audit exists because falsified national statistics, submitted to a government department for publication, are the kind of institutional failure that audit processes are specifically designed to surface and correct. Manager B has left. Manager A is, as the original account accurately describes it, sinking, not under the weight of my grievance, but under the documented weight of her own professional record. The emails that establish her accountability were written by her. The figures that establish the falsification were submitted under her oversight. The audit is reading both. I retained accurate records of my own work for over a year. I submitted those records through the correct channel before complying with my data deletion obligations. I did not fabricate, editorialize, or escalate beyond what the documentation itself required. The numbers were always going to tell this story. I simply made sure they had an audience. This has been another Revenge Jess cold-hearted case. The archive does not forget, and neither do I. Subscribe for more cases.